Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tracy Muller, and I'm Head of Advice and Philanthropy at Nedbank Wealth Management. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to host this webinar today. And I'd like to thank each of you for making the time to connect with us online in this way. And while we're connecting online in this way, it is important to reflect on connectivity and connections in general, but even more so when it comes to our money and financial matters. Because the reality is, every single financial decision we make impacts our ability to protect what is important to us and to achieve our life goals and aspirations. And in essence, that's why at Nedbank Private Wealth and Nedbank Financial Planning, we utilize our globally integrated advice-led approach to connect your financial decisions to your life goals and aspirations. Practically, this means providing our clients with technical expertise, appropriate opportunities, access to global solutions and services across Nedbank and other top providers. But most importantly, it's about connecting you to personal and objective advice to enable you to make better financial decisions, avoid financial disasters, realize your giving aspirations, and in essence, this is what we refer to as connected wealth. So before we get started with the order of the day, just the usual housekeeping matters. Thank you to everyone that submitted questions ahead of the session. It really does help us when we're preparing for these webinars to really understand what is top of mind for you. So please continue to do so. For everyone joining us this morning, please do make use of the Q&A chat function on the left-hand side of your screen. It's your opportunity to pose questions to the panel of experts that we have joining us today. During our last webinar, we were a bit of a trendsetter, and we're hoping to continue that trend today because we will formally close out the webinar after about an hour. But we will be staying on, and our MC will be chairing a Q&A section. So if you're unable to join after an hour, not to worry, because there will be a recording, so you can always watch that Q&A section at a later stage. If your screen should freeze, don't panic. Just press the escape button and the F5, and that should take you back to where you stopped watching in the webinar. So without any further ado, it's a privilege for me to introduce our MC today that's joining us. And in fact, our MC is joining us all the way from Atlanta, 3 a.m. in the morning. So Samke, thank you. We appreciate you joining us at that time of the morning. And if there is a slight delay in the actual signal that we're receiving, it is just because Samke is joining us from Atlanta. But just to formally introduce Samke Mhlongo, Samke is a leading SA wealth coach, author of Ring Fence, founder of the Next Chapter Wealth Partners, a well-known corporate speaker and radio presenter. And I think the best description I could come across was one ascribed by the CNBC Africa, where they described Samke as a personal finance goddess. So on that very warm introduction, thank you, Samke, for joining us. And without any further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for that lovely and generous introduction, and a very good morning to our viewers and our guests joining us from all over the world, really, because this conversation is applicable to anyone all over the world. I'm coming in from Atlanta. Bryan is joining us from the UK. And it really speaks to the topics we'll be covering today about global migration, about the fact that we can live and work and play anywhere in this post-COVID world, and that technology allows us to be global citizens. But with this freedom comes also the anxiety of asking ourselves, are we making the right decisions? What does this mean for my future, my retirement? Is it a good idea to stay in South Africa? Is it as easy to leave South Africa? I had the privilege of having dinner with Mum Felicia Mabuza Suttle, who many of you may remember from the 90s when she hosted a talk show in South Africa. And she was talking about the difficulty of disinvesting from South Africa and actually getting some of her money out. So these are some of the considerations you may be having, whether or not you're someone who's in the fortunate position of having savings that you want to take out or investments you want to take out the country, whether or not you're someone who's considering actually building up savings and investments in South Africa and all around the world, and whether or not you're someone like me who's thinking to herself, at this stage of my life where I'm nearing 40 and the decisions I made in my 20s are not as easy to recover from as the decisions I'm making now. So how do I make sure that every step I take is a step that secures my future, secures my well-being, and as a divorcee, secures my life and that of my children as I look ahead to a life where I no longer have the safety and security perhaps of a dual income household. So whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you're divorced, whether you're in South Africa, whether you're in the rest of the world, whether you're young, whether you're old, we will be covering topics that are relevant and specific to you, your situation, and of course, drawing from the many questions that were received in the registration. If you have any questions for us already that you'd like us to cover in this webinar, please do make use of the chat function. Pop your questions in there. I'll be popping in there to look and see how I direct the conversation so that we are addressing your concerns. This is about you. This is about ensuring that the information we pull out today answers you, makes you comfortable, and points you in the right direction with regards to the services and products and advice and experts available right here at Nedbank Private Wealth. But to give us insights into a future after retirement, the reality of life after a big rock star career, having to adjust to your retirement living and affording life using your retirement after perhaps living on the edge and living like a rock star is a household name that really needs no introduction, because I'm sure you can see from the face and you'll know from the name on the invitation, the legendary, the stuff of our memories, yeah, growing up, of our memories, the Rugby World Cup of 2007, which is a sport very close to South Africans' hearts, especially after 1995. Ladies and gentlemen, my absolute privilege, honor, and something I never thought I would get to do, but thanks to Nedbank, I'm doing it today. I introduce to you Bryan Habana.
Thanks, Samke. I'm a bit worried when you said you're nearing 40. I'm like, I'm probably closer to 40 than you are. So I'm not quite sure where you were watching the Rugby World Cup in 2007. But thank you for that incredible introduction. I know that the Nedbank team has already thanked you for getting up very early. I'm not sure if you've slept. So for those of you who don't know, it was Thanksgiving in the States over the last 2 days. So I'm assuming a 21-kilogram turkey, maybe, Samke, with maybe a couple of pieces of eggnog. So thank you for, being on this webinar. Thank you for, presenting it and emceeing it. It is a massive privilege for me to be engaging. Thank you to Nedbank for the opportunity to, briefly chat about my life as a professional athlete. And I have had the fortune of retiring early. Unfortunately, with that fortune comes a lot of interesting decisions that one, again, Samke, you said, if you knew what you knew now at 21, you do things very differently. And they say hindsight is without a doubt the best vision. As we go into this chat, I want to say I have made an incredible amount of mistakes. And I think everyone who tries to attain wealth through whatever source you try to do it does make mistakes. We'll go through quite a few Warren Buffett sayings, I think, throughout the course of the day. But I do want to, from the outset, state that I am not perfect. I think there are very few of us that are. I do believe that, the platforms that financial planners and advisors like Nedbank, for people who are uneducated, who aren't solely focused on, firstly, wealth, how to look after your wealth, how to make sure that there's a long-term perspective of how wealth is considered. So I will say, I have made mistakes, but I do want to say before that, good morning to everyone. I love to get on these webinars, and to Tracy Muller's point, we've probably, COVID's disbanded us from that emotional connectivity. And as much as remote working, as much as being together at certain times is great, there's been more efficiency, there's been more productivity. It has potentially burnt us out in ways that, we haven't really realized. And as I say good morning, I almost want to ask you all to just take 10 seconds to just breathe, in this ever-changing, fast world of adaptability, innovation, change management, just being able to as you go through the day, just take 30 seconds to breathe in, to stop, to focus, to be present. And I think in a world where, we're constantly challenged, a world where we're all constantly thriving, in a world where there's incredibly tough, financial circumstances that are facing most of us, if not all of us. Samke might chat about an increase in BPS that went up last night that, is affecting how we're thinking, how we using our money. So as much as I want to say good morning, I want to say that sometimes it's okay to not be okay, and that you have to be able to understand yourself better, because if you don't understand yourself, no one else in this world will be able to do that. So for those of you that don't know, I am Bryan Habana, named after Brian Robson and Gary Bailey, two Manchester United footballing legends. For my sins, I do support Manchester United. The 99 treble seems very, very far away at the moment. We just have Cristiano Ronaldo left. We have the Glazers potentially talking to Apple to take over the $5.6 billion investment that is the Manchester United commercial property. So grew up, born in 1983 in the apartheid era. I was very fortunate to have been exposed to a foundation that my parents really set up. I went to great schools. I was able to really dream extremely big, but I grew up wanting to be the next South African export into the English Premiership, wanting to play for Manchester United. So rugby was the furthest thing of my mind. And I know there's probably a few. I'm a geriatric millennial, which is, I think Samke, you're probably in my category with geriatric millennial. So when the term geriatric gets put in an association with me, I get a bit worried. So there might be a few Gen Zs, Gen Xs on the calls who weren't even a thought, let alone a consideration when the 95 World Cup happened. I was a 12-year-old boy. My dad took me out of school, and we drove down to Cape Town to watch the opening game of the Rugby World Cup. West Africa played against the world champions Australia at Newlands. An incredible experience as a 12-year-old. We had the 92 Cricket World Cup. We were experiencing a massive amount of change in a extremely immature young democracy, and the ability that sport had to start playing in bringing people together, breaking down barriers. 95 was at the forefront of being a catalyst of change. And witnessing grown men cry, which I couldn't understand. I'm like, why are grown people crying about a sport that I know nothing about? It was really weird. But yeah, went on that journey, and I was fortunate enough to be one of the 60,000 at Ellis Park on the 24th of June, 95, where Nelson Mandela walked out there in that number 6 Springbok jersey that was potentially seen as a symbol of oppression for many in our country. But the iconic Nelson Mandela really understood that the power that potential moment had to play in the unification and the breaking down of barriers and the transformation of minds in South Africa. And Francois Pienaar's words of, it wasn't for the 60,000 in the stadium, it was for the 48 million South Africans, lit a fire in a 12-year-old boy to want to one day do the same. And went on a journey. My first ever game of rugby was for the under-14 G side, and I know we have a lot of mathematicians, scientists, actual scientists on the call. My first ever game of rugby was for the under-14 G side, so A, B, C, D, E, F, G at King Edward's. So not quite how the fairy tale was supposed to start out, but nonetheless, being inspired to play this game that I'd now become so passionate about was unbelievable. Grateful for the foundations, the privilege and the opportunities that my parents gave me to go to good schools, to get a good education, but have the ability to dream as big as I possibly can dream. And I'll be realistic, not everyone, has the opportunity to dream big dreams. And not everyone is unfortunately successful, but I was given that platform. And 12 years later, I was in France winning a Rugby World Cup. And then I got to come back to South Africa and see the impact that it had. But sport really has the power to change the world. But unfortunately, sport is also a very unrealistic fantasy that you live in for the better part of 10 to 15 years. And I was a 21-year-old boy whose parents had sort of given him advice about savings, that let him understand certain topics. My dad was a successful businessman. We drove nice cars, lived in nice houses, but the fundamentals of finances were never really taught to me. So I didn't understand savings. I didn't understand the long-term effect. And who does when you're 18, 19, 21 years old? And I got thrust into this money-earning environment. And as much as 100,000 Rand a year back in 2004 was a lot of money for a 21-year-old who didn't really have expenses, didn't have a house, had to buy a bit of petrol that was less than 300-400 Rand a month. And I was still getting match fees and all these other things. But just knowing that I was getting this sustainable type of income, which hopefully increased a year later, I didn't understand finances. And the biggest thing when we talk about finances is talking about trying to teach yourself, because if you don't understand what's going on, the information that you get given is information that you need to be making decisions on. And if you don't understand where all that's coming from, how are you making good decisions? So yes, we're not all going to be actuarial scientists. Yes, we're not all going to understand markets, forecasts, budgeting. But I think there are certain basic principles. And one of the biggest pitfalls or mistakes I made as a 21-year-old, not understanding that you need to educate yourself. I signed 2 retirement annuities at 21 years old. Now, from a sporting perspective, you potentially have a 10 to 15-year career at the highest level if you're lucky. To sign something at 21 years old that would escalate at 10% per annum and only get access to that money when I was 55, but having to pay around about 16,000 Rand a month in terms of escalation costs at that point, I made a stupid mistake. I was an easy target. I didn't educate myself. I didn't understand, where life was going. And when my career ended, when I was 35 years old, I all of a sudden had this portion of money that I could no longer afford, because the unrealistic bubble that is professional sports made me earn the salary of a CEO from a very young age. And how I was looking at things, we've all made bad investments, we've all made bad mistakes, but that specific thing that I'd done at 21, I didn't understand the long-term effect that it was going to have at 35. And yes, there was a tax benefit initially. Yes, I was going to get the first 300,000 Rand tax-free, but I didn't understand that the impact it would have on a now very constrained budget, which I was no longer earning, was going to have on the decisions I made around medical aid, the decisions I made around insurance, decisions I made around having kids. And hindsight is without a doubt the best vision. But if I had just started understanding my money a bit better from a much younger age, I could have been making massive beneficial decisions that wouldn't have put me in, really, really tough times. And I think the biggest thing around, and we'll talk about retirement planning and, the advice that, the likes of a Nedbank can give you, who do you trust? I think that's very important. I've got to a point where, because of past circumstances, I struggle to trust. And if I don't understand something, I'm not going to do it. But, who do you open yourself up to trusting? What information do you rely on? And in the glitz and glam of being a professional athlete, a rock star that's earning the salary of more than a CEO on a yearly basis, skyrocketed, over a 10-year period, where are you getting information from to make good financial decisions? And, Warren Buffett, and there'll be quite a few sayings, says that risk comes from not knowing what you are doing. And if you're not daily understanding in turmoil, in rocky times, in disastrous times, in really positive times, what is happening on a daily basis, if you're only relying on people to give you information once a month, once a quarter, once every 6 months, that becomes almost intangible. And I think where I made a lot of mistakes, I just didn't educate myself to understand the basics. And I don't think you always have to understand the intricate detail of financial statements, processes, forecasts. But if you can understand the basics, and you can allow yourself to be able to know through the basics what is happening. But if you don't even understand the basics, all the information you're going to have coming into your ear is going to be information that you technically are relying on. And not only was I an easy target, because there were promises of, and we might chat about crypto, but there were promises of, incredible returns of 15 to 25 to 30% a year. And I mean, it sounds amazing when you're 25 years old, but practically, if I'd just known that returns like that were just too good to be true in markets that were volatile and ever-changing times. The financial crash in 2008, I just invested in a property in Dubai. And yes, no one saw it, but if I'd just done a little bit of due diligence, things would have been a little bit different in terms of the mistakes that I made. So I think in terms of understanding how we make good decisions, if you don't give yourself the opportunity to learn, to upskill, who do you trust? It becomes a much more difficult decision-making process. And I really do believe the more information you have, the better your judgment, but also the better your clarity is in the comfort that you can have in decision-making. And let's take cryptocurrency, for instance, blockchain technology. I love my tech. I'm very into the prolonged intellectual property of image rights. I do understand it a little bit because I did start studying BSc IT at Rao. I never finished, but I've always been very techie. I'll be pretty honest, I've made a very small investment in crypto and blockchain technology. The reason being is I went through all the information. I fully understood that there's a massive risk. I knew that whatever I'm putting in there is a risk that I'm willing to lose, and it hopefully won't affect my portfolio so significantly that it will put my financial environment under very strain. And the only reason I could make that decision is because I was comfortable knowing that should that portion of my portfolio crash, I'll still be okay with the other 94% of my portfolio. So are you making risk adverse decisions? Are you understanding what the long-term effects are of the decisions you're making? And I know they said that there's a few things in the financial environment that, are really good. And there's some 6 wonders of the world, like compound interest, that you really need to start understanding. But, as you're making these decisions, I think it's really important. And I think this saying from Warren Buffett is, for me, something that we should all really understand, that no matter how great the talent or efforts are, some things just take time. I think we're all looking for quick wins. There's a lot of things that get thrust in front of our eyes and on the TV screens, in the media, that shows us, fast, efficient, right now, right there. In my opinion, and again, I'm not a specialist or master in the space, unfortunately, if it's too good to be true, it normally is. And unfortunately, within the financial environment, things just do take time. Yes, there's some people that made a lot of money out of cryptocurrency. There's a lot more that lost. Yes, there's some people that go to the casino and win a lot of money. Stats show that casinos make 98% of money that comes into the organization. So you can't produce a baby in 1 month, by getting 9 women pregnant, unfortunately, as much as people would love to have kids. So we need to have an environment of continual learning. I think we need to have an environment where we're susceptible not to being predated on, but we're susceptible to opening our minds up and understanding. And basic terms like, do you have a will in place? In terms of your financial planning, are you understanding the greater aspect of your estate? I've been very fortunate. I played rugby overseas. I own foreign currency. Maybe had a property or 2 outside of South Africa. What was my estate duty should something happen to me? Is properties in various other geographies in the world, are they covered by a life insurance policy that, my wife doesn't have to struggle? And I think one of the biggest frights I had, and I'll be brutally honest, I came back to South Africa in 2018, and I sat with my financial advisors at Citadel, and as all they go through your planning and where you're going, and everyone said to me, okay, given what you have, if you stopped working today and you look on all your savings, your current lifestyle, because I'd become very cash plus in terms of what rugby gave me. Yes, I'd had some losses, but I was still much better off than my equivalent age, people that I studied with or been at school with. If you don't work another day in your life, you'll be okay for the next 2.5 years. And pragmatically took all the information that I'd given him, which again, who do you trust? How do you trust? All the POPI compliances, GDPR compliances in place. But I sat there in a cold sweat looking at uncertainty of what the next move is in my new phase of life. The mini debt I'd had from retiring in rugby, the uncertainty I had about what business I was going into, what opportunities are going to present themselves. And if something happened to me today, if I became disabled, if there was a work accident or something happened, I would only have been okay for the next 2.5 years on my current lifestyle. So how are you adapting accordingly to the lifestyle changes? Because if you don't increase from a salary perspective and your costs continually increase, at some point the pie just becomes minute. And I think it was then when I started understanding, do you create a structure outside of South African shores where it's outside of your estate? Do you put things that make it easy for your kids to know that compound interest over the next 15 to 20 years, or something as little as 100 to 500 Rand a month in the account, will be incredibly productive for them as a young child? So I'm just as interested as all as you of being able to listen to, again, what we're going to go through, the advice, the learnings, the educational perspective of what we're going to hear on this webinar. I know I've probably gone about 2 minutes over, but how susceptible are we to continue learning? And I think that's the point I'd love to leave us off with, because life is challenging, life is difficult. Costs are never going to decrease as much as we all would love it to be. Black Friday specials might sound great, but the markup revenue that companies have already made on a 500 Rand product that's now selling at 400 Rand is unfortunately still costing you 400 Rand. So how are we making good decisions? How are we trying to avoid living with the Joneses, living within your means, but planning appropriately for retirement? I'm not going to lie to you. I've had to retire once in my life already. It was probably the scariest thing because I hadn't planned properly. And I think opportunities like this through Nedbank Wealth Management to really understand financial terms, get advice, but to make good decisions based on the information you received is something I'm looking forward to, Samke. I know you are the goddess of finance, so I'm looking forward to you deliberating the session. We could potentially open up for a few questions, but it's great to be on this call. And I think if we're all appropriate enough to put our hands up and to say we don't know everything, we need as much help as possible to make sound decisions, and more importantly, to take accountability. And as much as there's financial planners, financial advisors, it's you making that decision. And you, unfortunately, as much as you would love to blame, if you've made that decision rightly or wrongly, you're the one that's got to face up to the music when it comes about. So be open to continual learning, be open to understanding that growth isn't a short-term road. It is a long-term journey that we all need to go on. So Samke, I'm really looking forward to the questions. I'm looking forward to learning a lot through the Nedbank Wealth Management team, around how we can retire right, because I've now started a new career at the bottom of the food chain, not remotely earning what I earned as a professional athlete. And, in 15 to 20 years, and in my opinion, I almost think 55's too young an age to retire. You need to realistically start planning to about 70, 75 if you really want to have a wealth environment, that sustains you for that last 25 years of your life, in my opinion. So to have targets that aren't standardized, that's the targets that sort of push the limits a little bit more.
Thank you very much for that, Bryan, and for your honesty around the mistakes you've made, having to make certain adjustments and having that aha moment that said, only 2.5 years is what I could realistically get out of my savings and investments if I were to start working today. I do have 2 questions I'd like to address from our audience, and please do use that chat functionality if you've got questions for Bryan. The first question I have is from Deline van der Merwe, who says, what would you suggest for young rugby players earning money overseas? Should they rather buy property in South Africa, or should they buy property overseas, or rather invest the money in an investment account? And I'd just like to caution, our audience before Bryan answers this, and perhaps for Bryan as well, that, let's perhaps be careful not to be seen to be giving financial advice, because as we know, you need to consult a registered financial advisor, and obviously they'll do a needs analysis that is specific to you, your requirements, your goals, where you are in your life, where you're trying to go. So perhaps, Bryan, more of a reflection on what you would have done differently as a young rugby player, in as opposed to giving Deline and other young rugby players. I'm thinking she's probably got sons or nephews that are young rugby players. Bryan.
Lena, so I'm hoping they're earning a lot more, because even in the UK, we didn't understand inflation. Inflation has increased massively. I've been sitting at various dinners over the last month or so, being up here, and people are talking about the concerns around energy crisis. I'm like, energy crisis? You people don't understand energy crisis. We've had rolling blackouts since 2008. You don't even know what inflation is. We've got unions that have been striking around inflation for the last 25 years. So what advice would I give? I think for them to surround themselves with people that can appropriately understand their situation, that can understand what they want to achieve. I think a massive stat that Jean de Villiers actually taught me 2 weeks ago in Marseille was that as an 18-year-old rugby player in South Africa, if you're playing first team rugby or schoolboy level rugby, the chances of you becoming a Springbok rugby player in the next 10-year period is 0.0058%. And as much as we all believe we're destined for greatness, as much as we all believe we'd love to dream big, the unfortunate reality is not everyone can retire from professional sports. And that goes for rugby, golf, cricket, tennis. So getting people that can give you good advice, and trying to be able to understand what that advice really means, and talking to those that maybe have gone through certain things. And as a rugby player, you live in a false reality for a very long period of time. You're earning a massive amount of money. What would I have done differently, Samke, at 21 years old? I probably would not have bought a 5-bedroom house, trying to keep up with the Joneses, because as a single well, had a girlfriend, but I was living on my own. And I look back and much people say property is a great investment because there's, continual growth. I actually lost money because I didn't understand for the first 7 years of my life, if I hadn't paid that house off, that I was just going to purely be paying on the interest. And then, the area that I bought in, wasn't an area that, boomed in terms of the property market. So I then sold that house at a loss, 6 years later, having not paid off a single cent on that house. So not only had I paid an exorbitant amount of money on the interest, but I made a bad decision because I felt I wanted to keep up with the Joneses. So I'm not going to give advice. I think it really is important to have people surround them that potentially have been there. So parents, lawyers, financial planners and advisors that can understand what their situation is. What are their costs? How do you budget? How do you save? Are you putting money away? How are your circumstances changing? Obviously, if you live in the UK, interest rates are much lower than in South Africa, but the size of a property in comparison to the price you have to pay for something like South Africa is much more expensive. So, you may be getting a 1 or 2 bedroom place, in London, and let's talk about London, that could be a 5 or 6 bedroom place somewhere in the Atlantic seaboard in Cape Town in comparison. So what is that decision you're making? How are you putting money away? And I think one of the biggest things is, how are you budgeting? How are you really understanding what's coming in, what's going out? Because at a point when you're 32, 33, 34 years old, and you haven't put those perspectives into place, and the stark reality comes, if you've just been getting free clothes. And one of the biggest things I tell athletes is that when you're done, the first thing you need to do is buy a new wardrobe, because you can't walk into a boardroom in your rugby tracksuit and khakis. You literally have to wear appropriate clothes, and not Adidas isn't giving you. So I'm not going to give advice. I think it is understanding people that you have in your corner, making sure that you make sure that those people give you advice that you can then make a decision on based on all the information, and don't just listen to one source. I do believe that the more sources you have, the better the information coming in is on which you can make a decision.
Thank you very much for that, Bryan. And Deline says, thank you very much for that. Before we head into the second part of our session, I'd like to do a quick fire one-word answer Q&A with you, Bryan, with regards to one-word answers here.
I'm no longer quick, so let's maybe go slow. So I'm no longer quick. I'm racing tortoises now in my retirement, Samke. So let's not go quick. Let's just go pragmatically at a pace.
No, this is fast fire, because I don't want you to think too much about this in case you lie and give me a PR-friendly answer. Okay, I want the truth. Number one, most expensive item you own right now?
My wife. I'm joking. I'm joking. Most expensive items definitely got to be my house.
Your house. Cheapest item you own right now?
Cheapest item. How cheap is cheap? Sorry. Probably the Starbucks coffee that I just bought, because it's mine now. I bought it.
Fair enough. Where have you lost the most money in your life?
Through trusting someone else.
Through trusting someone else. Where have you made the most money in your life outside of rugby?
Outside of rugby. Well, it was inside of rugby, but we actually had a specific pension fund set up for us as rugby players, and I unknowingly just kept on putting money away. And when I retired, the lump sum that I got at 32 allowed me to pay my house off. So as much as it's inside of rugby, the specific pension fund structure that was given to professional athletes or rugby players, because I was diligent enough to be putting money away, it allowed me to achieve one of my goals of having a paid off house when. So it was inside of rugby, but it was because it was a pension fund that we were able to have.
Final question. What is on your wish list for Christmas this year?
Be at home. Yeah, I've been away from home for just over 40 days. It's been a long time. I'm not going to be doing any sustainability projects. I've had quite a few flights, and it's been busy. I think the silos of being present with family. I've got 2 young boys, 8 and 4, and I think my wife is an absolute trooper. But yeah, I just want to be home and be present, because in a world where you're constantly being dragged into various different things, a silo that I probably haven't paid or haven't given much attention because of my travels and work has been my family. So I'm not going to be able to get off, because I do run a business as well. So I need to get back into the office, but yeah, just to be home and be present with my family.
Thank you very much for that, Bryan. And as you heard, it is the priceless things that money cannot buy which truly matter at the end of the day. So I would ordinarily say a round of applause for Bryan right now, but wherever you're watching from, I'm sure you can give a round of applause and truly thank you for that insightful reflection that you have shared with us. And ladies and gentlemen, it's quite important to hear the personal, real life stories of how these technical terms we use or these sophisticated products that come out really play out on a day-to-day basis in our lives and how they impact us. And so we are going to go a little bit technical now, where we speak around some of the developments in the retirement world with our specialists from Nedbank Private Wealth. And I would encourage you, don't get lost in the jargon. If there's something you don't understand, please do pop it in the question box and I'll make sure to ask our specialists to clarify. And I have the absolute privilege of introducing to you who is on our panel today. You'll see we've got a mix of wealth managers, we've got a mix of, a wealth manager, a tax specialist, an investment specialist, to really unpack the different topics from different angles. And before I introduce them, I'd like to highlight for you what we will be discussing in terms of the conversation pillars. So we'll be looking at the proposed two-part retirement system that is set to come into effect in South Africa from next year, 2024, my apologies, next year is 2023. 2024, we're going to look at immigration and your retirement. I mean, looking at where Bryan is, where I am, and I didn't tell you guys that I'm actually here visiting a very significant love interest of mine. So immigration may be on the cards for me. This is a topic that I'm really keen on hearing about. We're going to look at the increase in prudential limits and what that means for balancing your onshore, offshore investments. Is it really necessary when you can get offshore and international exposure even while invested in South Africa? So what really is the change to the prudential limits, and does it benefit us at the end of the day? And finally, we're going to look at how volatile markets impact your retirement savings, more the behavioral side, because we know that as human beings, we make the worst investors, because when we should be plowing into the markets, when markets are down, we are selling and running out. And then when we see prices increasing or shares growing in value, that's when we want to go in, when in fact, actually, you buy low, you sell high. I've been looking at the currencies quite closely, because obviously I'm trying to time the market. When is it that I buy my dollars, that I sell my dollars? And let me tell you something, when I see the rand strengthening is when I'm thinking, oh, I can spend my US dollars. Actually, no, strengthening, sorry, that's when I want to send it overseas. And I'm like, no, I should be doing it. I'm even getting myself confused because I don't know what I'm doing. I just go by what I'm feeling. So I'm hoping that the people on the line will help me, because I get spooked and then I take action when actually it should be rational always. And the panel we have is rational. We have Refilwe Mabiletsa, who is a wealth manager at Nedbank Private Wealth. A wave for us, please, Refilwe, so we know who you are. We have William Khwela, who is a senior tax specialist at Nedbank Private Wealth. A wave for us, please, William. And we've got Tracy Jensen, who is a senior investment analyst with Nedgroup Investments. And a wave for us, please, Tracy J. So I would like to invite you to unmute yourselves so that you can get the conversation started. I know that Tracy Muller, you'll also be facilitating the conversation with our panelists. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you to continue putting your questions. I see questions from Amit Sharma. I see questions from Maximilian Lagler. Dinewo, I see you. Yolanda, I see you. Marika, Sebastian, I see you. Martina. So please do continue posing those questions. I do see them, and we'll be going into those questions, weaving them into the conversation, but also we've got that Q&A session coming up at the end of the formal discussion. So do stick around. Over to you, to my panelists and Tracy M.
Okay. Thank you, Samke. So thank you for positioning the various topics. And I think the way we are going to just approach it is we have asked, each of the panel members just to very briefly give us a kind of highlight in terms of each of the topics. So I think to start off with, you spoke about the two-pot system that is being proposed to be introduced in 2024. And what I'd like to do is to just start and to ask William, if he wouldn't mind just very succinctly just summarizing what does it actually mean? There's been a lot of talk around this two-pot system, but what does it actually mean for us that are saving for retirement purposes?
Thanks very much, Tracy, and good morning, everyone on the line. Tracy, the two-pot system came about from the medium-term budget policy statement, where it was proposed that measures need to be taken to encourage households in South Africa to preserve the retirement savings during the working life, but at the same time give some measure of flexibility of access to retirement savings as well. So then the two-pot retirement system came about there, and since then changes and sort of legislative amendments have been going on to really bed down this two-pot system. But essentially what it is, it just splits your retirement benefits or pots or savings into two. One is one third will go towards your savings pot, the so-called savings pot, where you will have access to, and the 2/3 of your contribution plus the growth on there will go into retirement pot. However, this is scheduled for now, scheduled to come in only in 2024, 1 March 2024. So contribution from that date on will go into these two pots. That's what will happen. And you will have access to your savings pot once a year on a 12-month rolling basis. So that's really the basic side. While the retirement pot, you'll only have to annuitize when on retirement. Just to pause here, so that's a two-pot, which is looking forward. As we stand today, we have our retirement which we are contributing, others we are not contributing. Those will be housed in what we call vested pot. And that vested pot is still part of your retirement as we have today, and it will be valued just before the introduction or the implementation date of the two-pot. And in that vested pot, you'll keep all your rights that you have today. And for those who belongs to employer-based funds, like pension and provident fund, if you retire or retrench, even after the two-pot has been introduced, you will still have access to this vested pot as you would today. So in a nutshell is what is happening. So we're balancing two competing needs. One is access, the other is preservation. I hope we'll unpack this further on question. I'll stop here.
No, that's great, William. Thank you. So, I mean, in a nutshell, effectively, I think the intention, as you say, is to enable people in times that we've been through, in times of volatility and uncertainty, like with COVID that we've just been through, to be able to access certain parts of their pension saving, which I guess in one way is a good thing, because if people are going through difficult financial times, there's no point in having a pension that's saving and yet you're not putting bread on the table. So, but I guess it is a bit of a balancing act as well, because you don't want to detract from the perspective that you do need to save for retirement as well. But maybe if I can, Tracy J, if I could just perhaps ask you, because, obviously having these two pots now from an investment strategy perspective, what is the impact from that? What are the things that one needs to consider?
Thanks, Tracy. So good morning, everyone. So I think the key consideration here, and I know we've said it many times, and Samke also raised it, is to look at your situation holistically. Do you have other emergency savings or not? And I think a lot of people with COVID and going through difficult times have changed their view and do now have emergency savings. But If you have other liquid assets, you can consider investing your savings pot, that's your accessible portion, in something that's longer term. So that has a fair amount of shares and property, what we term risk assets, because over the short term, they can have a lot of ups and downs. And the reason you want to do that is because that's really what's going to give you the growth long term. However, if you have no other money, if something does happen and you fall on hard times and your savings pot, that's it. You might want to invest that more conservatively in interest earning type investments. There is a cost. Now, I don't mean in terms of fees, but basically, if you looked at two portfolios, let's take an example. I don't know, let's say Samke went with like a lower risk option and with all her money. And so she had about 40% sort of in shares and property and the rest was in interest. And let's say Bryan, after all his knowledge he's gained, he had like sort of your typical retirement fund of 70%. Samke would have to save twice as much to be in the same position as Bryan. So I think when I talk to the cost, is you really don't want to be investing your savings pot too conservatively if you don't need to and you do have access to other emergency savings.
Agreed. Thank you, Tracy. Refilwe, I mean, maybe we can just bring you in here if you don't mind, just in terms of, in your mind, what are some of the pros, but what are some of the cons of this new proposed two-pot system?
Thanks, Tracy. Let me start with the pros. So in principle, I understand what the government is trying to do, which obviously Tracy J alluded to earlier, which is to say it's very difficult to prioritize a long-term saving goal, like saving for retirement, when you're struggling to get by on a day-to-day basis. So it's in essence, it's giving you access to say, this is a pot of money that you can actually access to meet those short-term needs. However, the investment specialist in me obviously has to caution workers to say, you are effectively drawing down from your retirement before retirement age. So what you need to realize is that you're losing out on the returns that could be compounding over your working life by drawing down on this. So I do understand the need for it, but I also do want to caution people to say, be very careful, because in the end, this could actually have a severe penalty to your retirement wealth in the long run.
Absolutely agreed. Absolutely agreed. Samke, just checking in with you. Any comments or questions from your side before we move on to the next topic?
Two questions on the two-pot system, Tracy. One from Kevin saying, will the two-pot system apply to existing pension savings held in preservation funds?
Okay.
And the second question, perhaps I'll ask both questions in the interest of time. Martina says, because individuals are able to access their funds at 55 before retirement age, is that a good idea? And I think it speaks to the concern Refilwe just raised. So those two questions from Kevin and Martina.
Okay. So just in terms of the first one, William, just in terms of preservation funds, will it apply? And that was the question.
Tracy, I think, the two-pot system is driven by the contribution side. So firstly, it's looking forward from 2024. That's the first thing to just note. The second one, which probably is a positive note, is that there is a consideration from Treasury and industry, which Treasury really is looking hard on, is to transfer a portion from all retirement funds to just seed the cash, the savings pot. So that might talk to this question. So the seeding, meaning on day one of the launch of the two-pot system, there might be money if this seeding is acceded to. So that's what could address that.
Right, great. Thanks, William. Bryan, from your side, I see you would like to mention something?
Yeah, Tracy, and I mean, I sit in a fintech environment where our platform is earned wage access or on-demand pay, and some of the big institutions that we actually pitch to sit with a massive problem. Normally, sort of January, February, the start of every year, is where they're actually having people resign to try get access to a provident or pension fund. And I think to everyone on the call, I think we got some incredibly intellectual and knowledgeable people on this, on this webinar, which is really important. But when making these potential massive financial decisions around resigning from a company, you don't always understand the consequences or the the resultants of doing things like that. So I would almost suggest that if you are trying to make business decisions or financial decisions related to the business you're working in, if you don't understand the knock-on effects, and companies, you resign and you think you get access to your provident pension fund, but there is a knock-on effect. And for everyone on the call, if you are in a situation financially where you're needing access to a certain pots, whether that be savings, pension, or provident, and you're needing to make decisions, don't make them rashly, because I think you don't always understand the effects. And companies are facing situations where they're trying to retain people. Salaries aren't going to increase accordingly with the current rates that people are wanting them to increase at. But if you're making rash decisions with the thought that you're just going to get access to money, to the people on the call, it doesn't always work that way. So just a bit of advice in terms of how you make your decisions based on the information you have.
Absolutely, and sound advice. So thank you for that, Bryan. All right, just conscious of time, and I think just moving on to the next topic. I mean, clearly there is always in these webinars lots to discuss, clearly. But and when you're passionate about it, as we are, you can go on forever. But I think just to get to the next topic, and that's really immigration and the impact immigration potentially has on retirement saving. And I think just to position very briefly, just to share with the audience, what we do find as financial experts is that often our role is also a coaching role. And I think, Samke, you would be able to resonate with this as a financial coach, because when clients talk to us about the fact that they're looking to emigrate, we do need to unpack it a little bit more with them, because at times we do find, that when you start asking questions like, are you prepared to give up the lifestyle that we have here in South Africa, as an example? What does your support structure look like? If you're going to immigrate, because, who's going to look after, Bryan, your kids now, if you immigrate from South Africa and your family are here? It's those kind of tangible, real things that often people don't think through. And that, as our role as a financial coach, is really what we need to do. So often what we do find is that the clients are not necessarily looking to give up the lifestyle and that support structure and things they've become accustomed to, but it's more around planning a plan B. That if they need to, they would effectively be able to hop on a plane and go and live the lifestyle that they've become accustomed to. So I think just in immigration, I mean, Samke, you were chatting about it, that obviously you're considering doing it. And I think just a bit of food for thought around that is just to think through those other kind of things as well. But maybe if I can, just in terms of questions just on immigration, and I think if I can maybe just turn to you, Tracy J, just from an investment considerations, and what are some of the investment considerations that one really needs to consider if you are going to be looking at emigrating?
So I think the key thing here, as we all know, moving is one of the most stressful things, never mind immigrating and moving overseas, that you can do in your life. And I think in those situations, we tend to make emotionally driven investment decisions. And often the decisions around immigration are big, selling property in SA, which is an immovable asset that has quite a high cost to it, selling off all your assets and making these decisions, I think, sometimes too hastily. So the thing that I would caution against is first live there if you can, make sure this is definitely home, make sure you're going to stay. Don't make any big decisions. I mean, that's one of the rules of investments. Don't make any big decisions when it's in a very emotional time, which moving is. Unfortunately, I've seen many people, even in my own family and friends, who were adamant they weren't coming back and did come back. They had to reestablish their business they had. They lost a lot of money selling off all their assets. They had to start from scratch. So I guess if the biggest thing I can caution, if you can, hold off. And then coming back to retirement, which is obviously today's topic, is you have the option, once you've waited out your 3 years, to be able to cash in, but you pay a very punitive tax rate on that. So, yes, you can get the cash, but it's costly unless you are already over 55, then you can retire from it. Or you can wait it out. So I would really think very carefully about, is it worth waiting till you're 55? Do you want to pay that high tax rate? If you are going to wait it out now, which we're going to touch on later with the new regulations, you can invest 45% of that internationally, which can align better with where you're living. But yeah, just think very carefully and sort of wait before you make any big decisions.
Yeah. Great. And William, I mean, just very quickly, what are the kind of considerations from a tax perspective in terms of retirement saving? I mean, what would the impact be if one were to immigrate on one's retirement savings?
Hi, Tracy. Thanks. I think looking forward again, if we just covered all the three pots, looking forward and what we have now, look at the three pots. First, the savings pot, you will have access to it in future. There will be no issue. It's just that you will be taxed at a normal income tax marginal rates. And then the second, the retirement pot in future, that retirement pot from the two-pot system, you will have the 3-year rule apply, where you will have to wait 3 years since you cessation of tax residency before you access your funds, and in that case taxed as well on withdrawal tables. So that's another thing. DTA, double tax agreement, sorry for the acronym. Double tax agreement might come into play to regulate the taxation side between South Africa and your new country of residence. And thirdly, when we look at that so-called vested pot, which is what we have today, the vested pot, when you look at RA and the preservation funds where you might have withdrawn before, those will also be subject to this 3-year rule. Otherwise, on resignation, you can have access to your vested pot, employer-based funds, that is pension fund and provident fund, not necessarily having to worry too much about this 3-year rule if they are not restricted yet. I'll stop here.
No, that's great. Thank you. I think just moving on to the next topic, if we can, just once again, just being conscious of time. And Tracy J, I think you mentioned it, you touched on it already, just in terms of the increase in the prudential limits. But can you perhaps just kind of position that for the audience and what that means?
Sure. So when we talk to the prudential limits, what we're referring to is how much money within your retirement savings you can take offshore. And so that was 30% earlier at the start of this year. That has now shifted to 45%, which I think is really great. Not because I'm negative on South Africa. I actually really love South Africa. We have our challenges, but every country has its own challenges. But to put it in context, the South African economy is less than 0.5% of the world economy. So we're like this tiny, tiny little speck. And we already have a lot of exposure to South African assets. If you own property here, your job is often, linked to a South African company. So we're quite exposed to one small country in the world. And so being able to spread your investments in your retirement savings, which should be sort of one of your safest, long-term pots of money, is really a fantastic opportunity, and it's really worthwhile looking at that if your manager hasn't already shifted your money. It's something really good to look at.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. And Refilwe, I mean, just in terms of offshore exposure from a wealth advisory perspective, I mean, what are your thoughts in terms of, why is it important to get offshore investment exposure?
Yeah, so Tracy, just to add to what Tracy J added, so it actually increases the potential universe of investments that you can invest in, which is a good thing. So the benefit of that is that it actually adds diversification to a portfolio. And obviously, I don't want to get stuck on jargon. So just to explain that is by actually investing away from South Africa, what we're able to do is to reduce the risk associated with South Africa without necessarily decreasing the returns of the portfolio. Or put it another way, you can actually earn more returns for the same level of risk. So that's actually what we mean by diversification. I do want to also just add, I always have a positive and a negative. I do also just want to caution our workers out there and to our audience that's listening out there to say that, unfortunately, due to the volatility of the rand, having about 45% of your retirement funds invested offshore can actually potentially reduce a lot of variability to those returns. So if you're a young worker, not a big problem. Why? Because you're many, many years away from retirement. But if you're actually a retiree who's drawing an income from your retirement account and the rand is down 20% and you continue to draw down an income at a time when your investments have actually declined, you could run the risk of depleting your retirement assets ahead of time. So that's just something to bear in mind.
Right. Thanks, Refilwe. just the last topic, and I think, and Samke, I think you touched on this earlier, buying low, buying high, all of those kind of things. But I guess generally one of the fundamentals, and I guess it is always important to go back to the basics when it comes to financial planning and investment advice, etc. But we do go through times of very volatile markets. And, so perhaps, Refilwe, if you could just position, the kind of thinking in terms of retirement saving and the behavioral side in terms of our retirement saving and going through that volatility, and what as an audience or as individuals we should be considering through those volatile times.
Okay, happy to do so. So we obviously went through the pandemic, and what that did is that added a lot of stress in our lives. So mentally, physically, emotionally, we took a toll. But even more importantly, this also actually had an impact on our retirement plans. A lot of people lost their work. Other people have had to take, pay cuts. So it's actually had a direct bearing on our ability to save for retirement. And then coming out of the pandemic, if you look at this year alone, what are we facing? We're facing high inflation. I mean, Bryan alluded to this earlier, high interest rates. We're talking about geopolitical risks. So they're all sorts of factors. And then obviously volatility in the markets. Now, what this does tend to then do, as people have mentioned earlier, is make people very nervous, very emotional, and it tempts you to want to take either too much risk. So in other words, go cryptos. So go into the types of investments where you think you can get a 20%, 30% guaranteed return, which is appealing. Or for the other people, they just become overly conservative and they want to just put the money in cash. And obviously, I won't revisit that because Tracy explained the opportunity cost of actually being too conservative with your investments, especially if you're still a young investor. So what I can actually advise people to do is to say, at the end of the day, please don't try to navigate all of these things by yourself. I know it's tempting. There's a lot of information out there on the internet, on the radio, all over the place. But it is very important to try and speak to experts who've actually lived through these cycles, who've gone through and seen how markets perform, how they recover, how they dip, etc., and who can also help you stick to a disciplined plan. They're very basic things that you can control, and those are the things that you need to be focusing on. Don't worry about things that are completely out of your control, like the volatility of markets, like a war that's taking place somewhere else. Focus on what you can do, and I'll give you a few tips, and obviously later on, if people want, I'm happy to have sessions with them where I can take them into a little bit more detail. But things like start early. The money you put away in the first years of your working life will grow the most. So the sooner you start saving towards retirement, the better. Have a disciplined approach. Stick to a savings rate. If you're saving 15% or 20% of your income, stick to that. Make sure you invest it in an appropriate asset allocation that's right for you. So if you're young, you should actually have a lot of exposure to high risk assets like equities, like property, so that you can actually benefit from that compounding over time. And then as you approach retirement, make adjustments to that. So you might de-risk your portfolio and reduce the exposure to equities and property, and maybe get a little bit more bonds and cash, etc. But in a nutshell, just to summarize, these are very difficult, complex decisions, and you need somebody to basically walk that journey with you. And my recommendation was, please just try and seek advice. The first advisor that you meet, you might not necessarily have the best experience, but it is really worth the time and effort to find somebody who will be the right fit for you. Because by making a few minor adjustments to the amount you save, to the amount you spend every month, can actually have a very long-term benefit to you in the long run.
Great. Thanks, Refilwe. Just quickly, Bryan, I see you've got your hand up. You'd like to contribute?
Yeah, I think just following on from what Refilwe said, I know there's a question that's also come in from Marika Swartz saying that I'm assuming Marika was as a lazy person. I don't think it's as a lay person who doesn't understand the jargon. How does one start educating yourself to better understand financial planning, particularly for retirement? I think one of the great things I love to share, and I was very poor at it because I never got taught that. And we hear about this the whole time, but if you can actually create a budget. So firstly, understand what's coming in. Firstly, understand what are you spending money on, and then you can start making decisions about how much money you actually have available to start saving. We talk about financial planning, looking towards the future, but if you don't understand the current, it makes it very difficult to make decisions based on the future. So and again, teaching your kids that, teaching yourself that, going through a 3-4 month period of seeing what's coming in, seeing what's coming out, how much of the slice of your pie can you afford to give to, a financial retirement plan in some way or form. So if you don't budget, if you don't understand your budget, you're already putting yourself in the reverse understanding of where to go. So creating a budget, understanding and doing it for yourself before you actually go to a financial planner, because they're going to ask you for it anyway. And if you haven't done that, it just becomes another hurdle to overcome when you actually get there.
Great, thanks, Bryan. So really conscious of time, and we are a little bit over time, but I think just before we kind of close out, I mean, Samke, is there anything further from your side you'd like to add on this particular topic?
I think what I'd like to add, Tracy, before we wrap the formal side of the conversation, is just around how important this conversation is, and how important it is to not be those people that say, I should have, I could have, but rather to learn from the conversations that are happening right here, right now, to gain wisdom from the experts that are available, whether they be at Nedbank or another wealth manager, but to just start taking that step of saying the responsibility of my financial well-being resides squarely with me, the accountability aspect that Bryan was talking about. So I know one of my favorite quotes is, if you do, I'm paraphrasing, but if you do not learn through wisdom, then you'll learn through accidents. And you don't want to make accidents when it comes to your finances and your retirement, especially at a time when you are older and perhaps not as able to recover from that. So I know I've taken a lot from both the personal anecdotes, the questions being raised by our audience, and also some of the nuggets being shared here by the experts. And the questions are still coming through hard and fast. And perhaps before we wrap up, Tracy, you can let the audience know where they can actually reach out and contact Nedbank Private Wealth if they would like to take some of these questions offline, or if they need to jump off and can't stay further for the Q&A.
Absolutely. So there will be some contact details coming up on your screen. If you do need to reach out to us, to please do so. But as you've said, Samke, I think, just conscious of the time, we are well over time now. So I think just to close out this session, and then Samke is going to facilitate the Q&A session. So if you are able to join us, please do that. And hopefully we're going to get to each of your questions, or as many of them as we possibly can. But really, I think just in closing formally, thank you so much to Samke, to Bryan, and to each of our panel members for sharing their valuable insights with us today. As a reminder to the audience, Bryan spoke about who do you have in your corner to provide you with advice. So as a reminder to everyone online, at Nedbank Private Wealth and Nedbank Financial Planning, we remain committed to providing you with globally integrated advice and connecting you to more ways to enable you to make better life decisions and avoid financial disasters. Helping you plan for your retirement and the retirement that you want and you want to be able to realize is a cornerstone of wealth advice and financial planning. So how can we help you with your retirement? We have a team of financial experts who can work very closely with you to help you achieve your retirement goals. So in closing, if you would like to be invited to a smaller, more interactive session where we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty around retirement planning, we're going to be considering other retirement type vehicles other than your formal retirement vehicles, please join us for a conversation starter on the 8th of December. Please remember that you can get more thought leadership insights and recordings of our previous webinars on our website. So please visit the Nedbank Private Wealth and Nedbank Financial Planning website. Your opinion and your comments matter to us. So please do give us your feedback in terms of this webinar, things that we can improve. And there should be a QR code that pops up on your screen now, which you can just take a picture with on your phone. There are going to be some useful documents and other information that we'll be loading to our website, but that will all be contained in an email that you will receive with a link to the recording from this session as well. So again, thank you to Samke and Bryan and to each of our panelists. But most importantly, thank you to each of you for connecting with us online in this way today. We do look forward to connecting with you again soon. And until then, if you do need to leave us now, please go well. For those of you that can stay on, I'm now going to hand over to Samke, who's going to facilitate the Q&A section. So thank you, and over to you, Samke.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Yes, the questions that we have, I will just go from kind of what was asked first, and not kind of group them, so that I make sure that I try and afford everyone an opportunity of being heard. Amit asked, please advise what sort of investment you'd recommend for high inflationary environment that we are currently experiencing, in particular around retirement planning. And I think that's quite a great question when we speak about the risk of actually running out of your retirement savings before it is time. So I don't know if we're going to pose it to one of the panelists to take that.
Yeah, I think Tracy J.
Okay, so if you sort of go to the basics, and when I say the basics, I'm talking about the foundation, but I'll come back to it because things don't always hold in practice. As we know, markets are not always fully predictable. So when I say the basics, I'm talking about long-term sort of expectations. So if you invest in shares roughly long-term, you would have got about 7% above inflation. So that's definitely going to give you growth. Property is harder because there isn't enough long-term data. Property is generally a little bit less than that, but you've got to be quite careful with property, because I'm not talking about property like your house you own, which, as Bryan mentioned, you could buy in a really good area, you could buy in a bad area. I'm talking about a well-spread property investment will also tend to give you inflationary growth. Long-term interest investments, so we term it sort of bonds, in the long run is giving you about 2.5–3% above inflation. So a little bit, not nearly as much as shares. And then cash has roughly kept pace with inflation. Now, I think when I said sort of the basics, what I'm saying is, as we see, markets can go like this and they can be very different over a short period of time. So as Refilwe mentioned, the key is how long is your horizon? And the longer your horizon is, the more you want to be in things like shares and property, because as you can see, they're going to give you inflation beating high growth. But over short periods, it can be a little bit like the casino, or it can feel a bit like the casino, can be up and down and all over the show. So those are definitely the right things if you have the time horizon. There's also some rules around what you can invest in retirement funds. So for example, you can't have more than 75% in shares. But that's sort of the assets you want to look at.
Thank you very much for that, Tracy. Inflation beating. I always marvel when I ask people what they're invested in, or more importantly, what their return is. And they'll say, I think it's about 4 or 5%. And you're like, and inflation is that? So just something as simple as knowing that if you're not beating inflation, you're losing money is quite critical to saving and investing successfully. I've got 2 questions from Maximilian that kind of are related to each other. He says he's leaving South Africa next year for Austria, and is it possible to get help with setting up how he gets his monthly pension and investments paid to Europe? So this is to you specifically as Nedbank. And his follow-on question is that how does he protect himself against the falling rand when he has a fixed pension for life, but is now going to be living in euros? So his pension is in rands, but he's going to be living in euros. So if you could answer perhaps someone those 2 questions together for Maximilian Lagler.
So, I mean, I'm happy to just come in on the first part of the question, and then perhaps Refilwe could comment in terms of the foreign currency element. So in terms of setting up the payment, I would suggest that Maximilian does reach out to his banker and make, because they'll be able to assist to facilitate that, to make sure that the payment can effectively go through. So that would be my recommendation on that particular point. But I think the point around now effectively going to have expenses in a foreign country, but a pension that's rand-based, perhaps I could ask Refilwe just to comment on that.
So you can actually have offshore exposure, but that is rand denominated. So in other words, even if you just look at the JSE, a lot of the JSE listed companies actually earn their earnings from offshore. So, I think he doesn't necessarily have to worry about that as long as he's got a balanced portfolio that has, that's basically invested across multiple geographies, multiple currencies. So not just Rand exposure, USD, all the major currencies, even emerging market currencies. Then he doesn't necessarily have to worry about the fact that on a reporting level, that the actual retirement fund is denominated in rands. He can still actually have underlying, on a look-through basis, exposure to multiple currencies and geographies through his retirement account.
Thank you very much for that, Refilwe, and a very valuable conversation to have, Maximilian, before your move, and all the best with your move to Austria next year. I've got a question from Yolanda, who says, should one rather increase their contribution on their provident fund or take out an additional RA?
I'll take that one. So I think there's pros and cons to both. And as we said, we can't answer very specific questions because I don't know the whole situation. But one of the things I know I do, for example, at bonus time, I put that contribution into our company's provident fund. And the reason I do it is because immediately when they run it, it's tax deductible now. If I had to put it into an RA, I have to wait for tax season to get that money back. So that's one of the things you've got to look at. And then I guess other things are sort of a bit softer consideration is what are the investment options in your company fund versus the RA you're looking at? Are you happy with it? And also what are the cost implications? Because if you're investing for 30, 40 years, you really want to look at the costs between an R and a provident fund. In some cases, and that's why I say you've got to look at case specific, the company sometimes is able to negotiate lower fees than you would as an individual. So that's also something to bear in mind. So I think, yeah, not to give a clear answer, but those are the kinds of things to look out for and ask questions about.
Don't worry, Tracy. I'm of the philosophy that the best experts and coaches aren't those that give you the answers, but actually equip you to ask better questions, because the answers are forever changing. So if as a viewer and as a client, you're in a position where you can ask clearer questions and you know what triggers in the economy will actually move you to ask specific questions, you're in a much better off position than holding on to that one answer, which, sorry, my AirPod fell out, which may change with changing legislation or interest rates or inflation. So being in a position to ask questions is very valuable and to you as the investor. I've got a question from Dineo, who asks, I'm currently in my 20s. Please, can you share some insights or advice on the best ways one can invest their money and the benefits I can perhaps receive? I think we've answered that throughout this seminar in terms of from Bryan's stories and also about long-term investments. So I think I won't have that as a specific question that I ask, but I hope you have been answered, Dineo. Just wanted to acknowledge you there. And Tracy has two questions. Number one, how does one ensure best interest rates on the savings pot? And what happens if you don't touch these funds? Part B of her question says, who gives the best advice, or rather, who gives advice on the best long-term growth investment options for the savings pot? And I think, Tracy J., you mentioned that you don't want to be too conservative when it comes to that savings pot. And I think perhaps you're best positioned to answer that question. How do you balance having the savings pot be safe without losing out on the growth one could potentially earn on that savings pot?
Yeah, sure. So I think it does come back to what we discussed earlier is, do you have other savings in place that you can access? And if you do, then you can really look at investing your savings pot in a similar way that you would your retirement pot, which is typically around about 75% in shares and property, because as we mentioned earlier, that's really what's going to give you that growth over the long term, not over short periods necessarily. The interest rates is a little bit trickier because that changes all the time. Generally, if you're buying longer dated instruments, so what I mean is, like if you think about your home loan bond, that could be like a 20-year bond. So very similarly, you buy what's called bonds that pay interest, and generally the longer the term, the higher the interest rate, but that doesn't hold all the time. So things change all the time. And as you know, we have the interest rate hike. So it's very tricky to give a clear one-fit answer to where should you invest for the best interest rate.
And perhaps the question should be, or perhaps the answer should be know which questions to ask. So no, okay, should I be invested in cash? Should I be invested in equities? What's happening in the markets? No, with the inflation outlook, does it make sense for me to be in cash? Or perhaps I can look at other ways of funding my emergency cash needs should they arise. And I can therefore put my savings pot into a stickier instrument because I need that growth to beat that inflation. So Tracy, I hope we answered you by giving you some questions you want to consider with the changing environments. Andile van Heerden says, what is your advice for people who do not have permanent employment to maximize their retirement investment aside from maximizing the 27.5% RA contribution? So what is the advice for people who do not have permanent employment? So for entrepreneurs like Bryan and myself to maximize our retirement investment. Tracy M., you can direct me on who will take that question.
So Refilwe, I'm not sure if you'd like to come in here. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're really maximizing your contributions, your annual, contributions towards a retirement account, I think already that's job well done. So from a tax perspective, you are already benefiting from that. But try to think of your money in terms of it, in terms of pots, in terms of like just thinking of a savings or a retirement or this. And this is again, why the benefit of advice is so important, is that you're supposed to look at everything holistically. So yes, retirement has a purpose and it's got rules that govern it, and it's there for a reason and it works a particular way. But any investment, whether it's through a unit trust, whether it's a share portfolio that you own, it doesn't really matter what it is. At the end of the day, it has to be determined by you, your needs, your objectives, and as Tracy mentioned earlier, your investment horizon. So I would not necessarily say only think of saving in terms of saving for retirement. Think about all of your investments holistically, but most importantly, do actually speak to somebody who can see all of the parts and how they fit in together, so that you know constantly you're working towards a specific goal, as opposed to having a little bit of money that you then treat, because that's where the behavioral biases come in. If you look at this money as money that's for retirement, then you treat it a certain way, and then that's money that's for this and for that. But I think it's actually very important to always come back and have a holistic view about how you manage all of your money.
Speaking about people at Nedbank we should be speaking to regarding these decisions, Sebastian asks exactly that. Is there a way that one can get an advisor that he can see? He started late to focus on pension and savings. Don't worry, Sebastian, many of us. In fact, the statistics said what? Only 6% of South Africans can afford to retire comfortably. That may even be lower given inflation outlook, given what the Rand has been doing. And so he says he wants to look at pension and savings and to invest aggressively. There's that behavioral change we're seeing. You should probably, if you're starting late, you should be investing conservatively, not aggressively, but I'll let the experts speak to that. So Tracy M., who will take Sebastian's question around investing, starting late, and the best way to invest when you start late?
I think Refilwe, once again, just from a wealth advisory perspective, will be best placed.
Happy to take that one as well. The reality which I touched on earlier, Sebastian, is that the sooner you start, the better off. So if you start as young as 18, 19, you might only have to start saving, let's say, 500 Rand a month. But to get to the equivalent amount, if you're only going to start at the age of 40, you might have to say start with 3,000 Rand a month. So it's never too late, Sebastian, as I did say earlier, by making just certain tweaks to the amount that you spend. Bryan spoke about this. Have a budget, be disciplined, and then work a plan. So you do need to speak to somebody who can then help you and advise you on, even if you're 40, 45, 50, it doesn't matter what the age is, you will start with where you are, because it's better to start then than to just give up and say, what's going to happen, because then you don't have a safety net when you turn 60, 65. So I would say to you, don't worry, don't feel bad about it. That's our job, is to actually help you and to meet you where you actually are.
Tracy J., I see your hand is up.
If I can add to that, and it's maybe not an investment consideration per se, but if you are able to delay your retirement by about 4 years, it has roughly a 10-year impact. So that sounds like too good to be true. But just to unpack that, you are saving for 4 more years. and you're not drawing an income for four of the years. So that's already 8. And then you've got that compounding magic we were talking about, which makes up about another 2. So sometimes our investments just can't work hard enough. I know the one question was about aggressive sort of returns. Sometimes we also have to make a little bit of tweaks and adjustments to make sure we can make it.
Thank you very much for that, Tracy J. I see we have just 5 minutes, well, just under 5 minutes. Tracy Muller, is that correct? Should we start wrapping up?
That is correct. We can start wrapping up. Thank you, Samke.
Okay, perfect. To everyone else whose questions we did not get to, those contact details of the Nedbank specialists you can approach after this webinar to pose your questions and find out more about what's available is available. So please forgive us for not being able to get through to your questions, but we're so grateful that you have all these questions with regards to the topics we are discussing today. Tracy, over to you.
Okay. Great. So thank you, everyone. And thank you for those that were able to join for the rest of the Q&A section. And I think if there's anything that we can walk away from today, I think there's a couple of things. And I think, Bryan touched on these things as well. But I think the first thing is the sooner you start saving for your retirement, the better. I think it is important to make sure that you've got someone in your corner that you trust and that you can speak to and make sure that you do get appropriate advice. And as I said, from a Nedbank Private Wealth and Nedbank Financial Planning perspective, we would like to be that trusted person in your corner. So I think just in closing, thank you again to everyone for joining. Thank you again to Samke, Bryan. Really wonderful to have you join us. To each of the panel members, thank you for sharing those valuable insights. And to the audience, those that are still online, we do look forward to connecting with you again soon. So until then, go well and stay safe. Thank you.